Hi Year 6, we hope you're looking forward to another science topic. Today we are starting a new block on evolution and inheritance. So our success criteria for today is to look at the evolution of animals and how have they adapted in order to survive. So we're going to learn about some famous scientists and their discoveries. We're going to have a look at some adaptations of animals and natural selection, and we're going to research an animal and the adaptations it has. So, as a recap to get started, can you tell me what these pictures are of? Fossils, that's right. So, what can you tell us about fossils from what you've learned before? You might be able to tell us how they're formed, or what they're formed on, usually. You could try and have a guess at what some of these fossils are. So what animal have they come from based on their shape? So pause the video now, see how many things you can write down on a piece of paper about fossils. Brilliant. So to start us off, we are going to have a look at some famous scientists. So do you recognise this lady in the picture? Or could you figure out some things about her based on what you can see? So pause the video now, see if you can write down some ideas about this image or who this is. Okay, so some things that I got are that she is a female and she's a female scientist. I also had a look at this picture and thought, well, the clothes that she wears and some of the equipment she's got isn't something that we see a lot of today. So it looks like it's from a long time ago. And it also looks like a painting. So this picture was painted from a time before even cameras were invented. So it's from a long time ago. And the last thing that I spotted was to do with where she stood. And you might have noticed that this bit on the picture is actually the sea, and she stood on some rocks. So one of the things that I wrote was that she stood on some rocks next to the sea. And this lady is a lady called Mary Anning. So there's two more pictures here, one with Mary stood next to a skeleton or a fossil, and one with her next to a cliff with some rocks underneath. So what do you think Mary Anning discovered? So she was an English fossil collector. So well done if you said you thought that she was somebody who discovered fossils. And she found Jurassic marine fossils near the beach where she lived. So things from the Jurassic time, and they were to do with animals or plants that lived in or near the sea. And then this second picture is where Mary Anning found some of her fossils. So she was a lady who lived from between 1799 to 1847. And the map on the left shows us where she was from. So she lived in Lyme Regis, which is in Dorset on the south coast of England, where this yellow dot is. And she looked for fossils in the cliffs. And she often did this in wintertime because that was when the sea was really high and it used to come up and hit the cliffs and break them down. And when pieces broke off, Mary used to go and collect them to see if there were any fossils in them that she could find. And she also discovered one of the first dinosaur skeletons, and a little bit later she found two skeletons of dinosaurs that were almost full skeletons. So from fossils we can see that over time living things have changed. So on the picture on the left, these animals here look like whales, and what we know whales to look like at the moment. But if you have a look at how they've changed over time and go right back to the start, this animal doesn't look like what we imagine a whale to look like now. If you have a look at the next one, starts down here 54 million years ago, and this animal to me is very small and it looks a little bit like a dog. But actually, over the years, it's got bigger and bigger until now we've got to what we know is a horse. So that's how that animal has changed over time, and we know that because of fossils of things like its bones, and we can look at its feet. And then this image over here is a really famous one that we're going to have a look at later on, of a bird. So it starts here, goes to the next point, to this one, and then to the last one, which is number 4. And you can see that over time, this bird's head shape and its beak has changed quite a lot. So famous scientists have tried to discover why these changes happen to these animals over time and why animals are different. So from this diagram, we can see that everything starts off as a group of cells. So every living thing, plant or animal, is made up of some cells. But we can see that actually the animals that those cells turn into can be very different. So you can have animals with shells, like a snail, or animals with wings, like a butterfly or a dragonfly. We've got animals that have gills, like fish. We've got animals with fur, like the fox up here. And we've also got animals that have wings and beaks. So from this group of cells, animals might change or adapt and end up as something else. So another scientist who had a look at a very similar thing was somebody called Charles Darwin, and he was alive from 1809 to 1882. So pause the video now and try and figure out if you know what he was famous for, or if you've heard of him before. Okay, so this is a little bit of history about Charles Darwin. He was born in this house, which was called the Mount, and it was near Shrewsbury in Shropshire in England. And he was the son of somebody called Robert Darwin and his mum, who was Susanna Wedgwood. And Robert Darwin, who was Charles's father, was a doctor. So they were quite a wealthy family, which is probably why they could afford this house with a huge garden and really nice grounds. And sadly, Charles's mum passed away in 1817. And shortly after that, so a year later, he went to school, and he was at boarding school, so he lived there. And it was a grammar school not far from where he lived. And he learned lots of subjects. He particularly enjoyed learning about nature, and he liked to go, in his spare time, he liked to go with his uncle on trips to go bird watching. But whilst he was at school, he really hated subjects like Latin and Greek, which were subjects that they children often studied in those times, and they were expected to learn those languages by heart. So once he'd finished school, his dad wanted Charles to become a doctor. So he sent him to Edinburgh University to study medicine. But Charles actually discovered that he was afraid of blood while he was there, so that wasn't going to be very good. So his dad decided to send him to Cambridge University to try to become a priest. But Charles didn't really enjoy that either, and he just enjoyed learning about nature, and he continued to do things like collect beetles. So this is a huge beetle collection. You can see some big ones, some really tiny ones. He's probably got ones with different coloured bodies and different wings that he used to collect while he was there. And during this time, a professor noticed his passion for living things, and he helped him to study. And in the end, Charles took some exams, and he was actually ranked 10th out of 178 people in his final exam. So he was really good at what he did. And as a result of this, he got the chance to go on a trip around the world on a boat. And this boat was trying to map islands around the world, so pieces of land or parts of land, so that they could put it on a map and let other people know where land was. But Darwin actually just wanted to go, and he wanted to find out more about living things at all of these places, and it was a great opportunity to do that. So he also wanted to collect some evidence so that when he came back, he could carry out some detailed research. So on this trip, some of the countries that they visited included Australia and the Falkland Islands. They went to South Africa, but they spent a lot of time on the south coast of America, so places like Brazil and Chile, but they also visited the Galapagos Islands, where they spent most of their time. And it's where a lot of Charles's most famous work is based. So, whilst he was there, he studied lots of plants and animals, and it led to his famous theory of natural selection, or the theory of evolution. So the Galapagos Islands are quite isolated, they're far away from anywhere else, and as a result of that, not many people visit, and they still don't now. So it's got a unique habitat and lots of animals that were undiscovered and people didn't know about. So Charles filled lots of his notebooks with things that he saw and drawings of these animals and plants. And he also collected lots of things to take back with him so that he could carry on studying them. One of the things that he spotted while he was there was these giant tortoises, and we're going to have a look at another photo of that later on that shows you just how big they are. And these are some of his drawings of them. And whilst they were there, they actually rode them like horses because they were that big, and they thought they could at the time. But they also shot 18 of them and used them as something to eat, because on this journey they needed some food. And it wasn't until after, when he'd returned, that he thought he maybe shouldn't have done that, because they were really important to the other animals that were there and the plants, but they were also important with his discoveries. So he arrived back in England in 1836 and returned to Cambridge, and he kept on looking at the things that he brought back to see if he could figure out more about them. So one of the things that Darwin believed in was something called natural selection, and he thought it happened because of adaptations. So natural selection is the idea that living things which are most suited to the environment that they live in are the ones that will survive. So they change over time so that they are more likely to survive, and that might be based on the habitat that they're in or the food that's available. So one of his most famous studies was of this finch on the Galapagos Island and the size of their beaks, and he wanted to know, why did they become smaller? So after studying and discovering lots of different species of animals, so we looked at lots of birds and fish and insects or reptiles, he noticed that not all of those are the same, and they adapt to survive in their habitat. So I've got some examples for you that we see today. So we've got types of dogs. We've got dogs that we see in England that people have as pets, so Dalmatians and Labradors and pugs. And then we've got wild dogs, so things like hyenas. And not all of these dogs are the same for different reasons. Some of them are small, some of them are tall, some of them are spotty, some of them have really long fur, some of them have grey fur, and that's for a reason. Okay. Other animals that we can see these sorts of differences in are fish. So you've got goldfish that are orange and you can have at home. We've also got things like sharks and stingrays, swordfish, so lots of different shapes. And then another animal is cats. So some cats have really small ears, some of them have really big ears like this one. This one's not got any fur, it's just got skin, and that will be for a reason. Some cats are big like tigers, but even those ones are different to something like a panther or a black leopard. So Charles Darwin's theory of evolution tries to explain how animals are different and why they are. So I've got a video for you to watch about adaptation, because that's what he called these differences between animals.
Suppose there's a population of horse-like animals and they're living on grassy plains. But suppose these horse-like animals have teeth that are small and not great at grinding tough, coarse grass. The animals can survive if they can find soft fruit to eat, but without fruit, they tend to go hungry. Now, suppose it just so happens that some of the animals in the group have teeth at the back, molar teeth, that are taller and have ridges. These animals find that they can use their ridged molars to grind the tough grass. The animals that have these ridges on their teeth are more likely to survive than some of the other animals, and if they're more likely to survive, they're more likely to have offspring. Okay, so animals with ridged teeth are more likely to have offspring than animals with small teeth. Why does that matter? Some things can be inherited by offspring from their parents. So if having ridged teeth is something that can be inherited, then the offspring of the horsey animals that have tall ridged teeth are also likely to have tall ridged teeth. And over many generations, we end up with more and more animals with more and more tall ridged teeth.
So here's where it gets really impressive. These little changes keep on happening generation after generation, and gradually they add up. After many thousands of generations, we're seeing animals that now look quite different. Here are the descendants of Eohippus after 20 million years, and now they look very different indeed. This is now a new species of animal, and this is how a new species can come to exist.
So that video tries to explain an example of an adaptation that an animal has and why it's beneficial and helps it to survive. So what Charles Darwin thought was that over time, animals evolved to have slightly different characteristics to suit their environment that they live in. So some examples of these might be that they're taller to reach food. So some giraffes will have grown taller than other ones, and it will have helped them reach the tallest trees, and then they're able to survive. It might be that they have longer legs to run faster, and that might be helpful if they're an animal that needs to escape from prey. Could be that they have fur to keep warm. Well, if an animal gets longer fur and it keeps it warmer in a really cold environment, that one's more likely to survive. It might be that they have sharper teeth so that they can eat other animals, or it could be that they eat plants like the video that we've just shown. They might have bigger muscles to be stronger if they're an animal that has to fight for their survival, and it might be to do with the colour of their skin that adapts so that they're actually better able to camouflage and hide from predators, or it might be that they have to shelter from the heat. So an adaptation is the process where a living thing changes to suit the environment or habitat that it is in. So this is what the Galapagos Islands looks like now. So a group of islands in the middle of the ocean near South America. So we're going to have a look at what characteristics some of the animals that live there have in order to survive. So one of these animals is an iguana, and there are two types. We've got a marine iguana, which is the one on the left, and we've got a terrestrial iguana, which is one on the right, and they live on the land. So the marine iguana can only be found in the Galapagos Islands, and they are the only type of iguana that forage for food underwater, and they can actually dive down to a depth of 9 to 12 metres. It has a tail that's shaped to help it swim underwater, so it's a wider tail, it's long, and it helps it to move back and forth and dive down deep. Some of them can be bright green or orange, which is probably to help them when they're in the sea because they can camouflage, and others are a more brown colour. And they have claws to help them grip the rocky surfaces, especially during higher tides. So those iguanas like to live in groups as well. But the land iguanas are slightly different. They've adapted in a different way to help them survive where they live. So these ones don't really go near the water at all, and they prefer dry, arid conditions like living near to the volcanoes on the island. They are usually yellow or brown, and they have longer snouts, so longer noses, than the marine iguanas. And that's because they eat different things and have to get their food out of the rocks. Their tails are shorter and they're more round in shapes, and their claws are also shorter. And they prefer to live alone. So a different animal that we're going to look at is the Cellulite foot crab or Graspus crab. So they're both the same animal. And this is what they look like. They're very, very colourful. So they are agile, and they are saltwater crabs that are often seen on rocky outcrops. They are predators and will eat almost anything from barnacles to young sea turtles or the crabs. They eat young birds, they eat broken eggs, all sorts of things, and their claws are really useful for that because they can snap open things, so like the eggs or the sea turtle shells, but they can also scoop out the food that they need. So they've adapted to protect themselves from predators. So when they're young, their shells are actually a dark brown colour or black, and it helps them to blend in and camouflage with the rocks that they're on. But as they get older, their shells get harder and it toughens to protect their sort of fleshy inside. And that allows them to turn into a brighter colour because they're able to protect themselves in a different way. And that bright colour attracts other crabs as mates, so that more crabs are born. And one of their defences that they have, because they're so bright, is that they are able to shed a leg. So if one of their legs falls off or gets pulled off, that's okay, or they can actually let them drop off if they feel threatened, and they can regenerate it, they can grow another leg. But they can also spray water at predators to try and get them to go away. So, different animal, this time it's a bird. And this bird's quite unusual because it's got this big red bulge under its beak and its belly. It's a seabird that have mostly black feathers. And something unusual about these is that the female bird has a white underbelly, but the males have this big red pouch, like the one on the image. And they can inflate it and it attracts females. So it's the same sort of idea. So being colourful attracts the females. Their wings are long and pointed, and they can actually span to 2.3 metres wide, and that allows them to fly for weeks on end, which is quite unusual for birds. They also have really long and pointed beaks, so this beak comes down in a really sharp point. And their main prey are fish and squid, that they actually, when they're flying over the seas, big tuna fish scare the little fish and the squid up to the sea level, and the birds are able to go down and catch them. But they're also able to snatch small seabird chicks from nests, and they will eat those as well. And the oldest fossil of one of these birds dates back to 50 million years ago. So a long, long time ago, that these birds have managed to survive because of some of the changes that they've made. So the next animal is the Galapagos penguin, and this penguin is the only type of penguin that lives on the north of the equator in the wild. So this is something that we've looked at recently. We know that usually north of the equator you get polar bears, and polar bears and penguins do not live together. So that we figured out that penguins were actually in the south. But this is the only type of penguin that lives north of the equator. And it's endemic, which means native. It's the only place it lives. So it only lives on the Galapagos Islands. And it's a really small breed compared to other penguins. It's only 49 centimetres tall, which allows it to squeeze into small caves and crevices and it to hide from the sun. Because we know that penguins actually prefer cold climates usually. So it's mainly found out of the Galapagos Islands. It's mainly found on the Fernandina and Isabella Islands, but sometimes you can spot them in the water near another one of the islands as well. And they've adapted by learning to lean forward. So you can see this bird on the right is leaning forward, and it actually enables it to shade its feet from the sun because they're going to get really hot. And they also, to help cool themselves down, put their flippers to the side because that also helps to shade their feet. It keeps it under their body. And they can pant, which helps them to cool down as well. So unlike other birds, they've learned different ways of cooling down and getting out of the heat when they get too hot. So Darwin's theory suggests that over time, animals and plants change and evolve because their offspring have slightly different characteristics to the parents. And if this characteristic that's different makes their life easier and they become more likely to survive, they are the ones that are going to have offspring again and pass on this characteristic to the next generation. And it's known as survival of the fittest, because the best characteristic is the one that survives, but it's also known as natural selection. And it helps us to understand, or it gives us an idea as to how species might have changed over millions of years. So evolution is the idea that living things have developed and changed over time. So, just a few more interesting facts for you. Charles Darwin's face was actually on the old £10 note, and there's a statue of him in London's Natural History Museum, and more than 120 species of animals or plants have been named after him. Some of them are ones that he discovered. So, like the finch that we saw is called the Darwin's finch, and others have gained a name after him as well. But this £10 note, if we have a look a bit closer, has something on it that I've circled. So as well as his portrait, it also has an image of the ship that he sailed on, so the HMS Beagle. So your task for today is you have a word grid, and we would like you to say whether you have never heard it or heard it before today's lesson. So if I never heard of evolution before today's lesson, I would have put yes in the never heard column. Inheritance might be a word that you had heard of, so you would write yes in the heard column. If you'd heard of adaptation before, you would put it in the heard column. It doesn't necessarily mean you know what it meant. Okay, you should have heard of fossils before, so you would write yes in that column. What we would like you to do once you've completed all of that is write down the meaning of all of these words on the left. So you might have to search some of them on Google, or you might have a book or something that you'd like to have a look in, but we would like you to write down the meaning of them. Some of them, so evolution, adaptation, you might be able to find out natural selection. Charles Darwin, you'd be able to tell me something about him. Offspring, you should be able to tell me something about from today's lesson. You will be able to go back through this video and find out what it means and write it in your box on your worksheet. Once you finish that, your next task is to choose an animal from the Galapagos Islands, or an animal that lives there, and research the adaptations it has in order to survive. So you've got 3 questions to answer. What characteristics does the animal have? So tell me what it looks like. What colour is it? What sort of fur or feathers or skin does it have? Why do those features help it to survive? They might not all help it to, but some of them might help it to survive. Does it help it camouflage? Does it help it catch things? And what does the animal eat? That might be something that comes as a result of you telling me what features help it to survive, and any other interesting facts you can find out about it. So my next slide has lots of examples of animals that you could choose if you're not sure. So the ones in black writing have an image underneath them. So we've got the giant tortoise, and in the bottom you can see a lady crouched down next to it to show you how big that tortoise is. We've got flightless cormorants. Well, cormorants are birds that we can actually have in England, but not flightless ones, or you might be able to find out something about why they are flightless. There's Galapagos barn owls. You might be able to tell me about the batfish, lava lizards, stingrays that are there. You could tell me about the Galapagos flamingos, sea lions that are there. Darwin's finch would be a good one. There are whales at the Galapagos Islands, white-tipped reef sharks. Choose one that you are interested in and answer those 3 questions about it.